We Australians are very interested these days in our pioneering forebears. We often think we can't know much about them unless they became famous or left extensive personal records. John and Eliza Sharwood, who migrated to Australia in 1841 from Rye in the English county of Sussex, never became famous, and they left few private records. But we can in fact trace much of their story from public records, and we can illustrate it from early family photographs and other sources. And what is then revealed is a most interesting picture of pioneering endeavour. And it's not an unimportant picture because it almost certainly represents the experience of many of the migrants of the early 1840s. Most of their stories may indeed be lost, but that of John and Eliza happily proved not to be lost. And it's that story that we are now about to explore together. Here are photographs of John and Eliza taken in Ballarat in the early 1870s when they were in their early 50s. We have no images of them as young people, but let's look a little at their background, at where they were born and brought up, of what we know of their families. And let's look first at that unusual surname Sharwood, which might itself be the bearer of significant and ancient information about the family. If you look up the name Sharwood in a dictionary of English surnames, you're likely to find that if it's mentioned at all, it's recorded as a mere variant of Sherwood, and it's linked with the great Sherwood Forest in Nottinghamshire in the English Midlands, the home of the legendary Robin Hood and his merry men, to say nothing of Maid Marian. And in this connection, I've seen it suggested that Sharwood actually preserves the original pronunciation of Sherwood. That just as we spell the word clock with an E, but pronounce it as if it was spelt with an A, so originally Sherwood, though spelt with an E, was pronounced Sharwood. In other words, the references were to Sharwood Forest, and it's suggested that it's this original pronunciation which our particular surname faithfully preserves. Well, that Sherwood Forest theory might well be true for some of the Sharwood families, but I doubt if it's true for our own, because we know from the public records that our family had been living for a very long time in the extreme south of England, on the Great Romney Marsh, near the borders of Kent and Sussex, and that they'd been living there since at least the 17th century, which is as far back as my researchers have taken me. On Romney Marsh, our family, according to the records, were farming small properties and engaging in various country and coastal crafts like wheelwrighting and boat building. They were, in the strict sense, Kentish yeomen, the yeomen of England. It is theoretically possible that they might have moved down to that area from Nottinghamshire at some very early date, but it's not very likely. Roads were appalling, transport was very primitive, and English rural populations in those early centuries were largely static.
And nations to eastward, and nations to westward, as foemen may curse them, the yeomen of England, no other land can nurse them, but their motherland, old England.
There are, in fact, several possible southern coastal origins for the name Sharwood, and although none of them can be proved, they do at least provide alternatives to the Sherwood Forest theory. Thus, King William the Conqueror's Domesday Book of 1086 records some Saxon landholders in this area in King Edward the Confessor's time, and they have names which could well be precursors of the name Sharwood. Further, old gazetteers list a Sherwood just inland from Hastings, which is close to Rye, and a Sherwood inland from Chichester, which admittedly is some distance from Rye, but is nevertheless in the same coastal region. So, for myself, I'm much inclined to the view that our family took its name a very long time ago, either from some local geographic feature in the Kent-Sussex coastal region, or perhaps indeed from the name of some early and again local Saxon family. At all events, there they were at the end of the 18th century, yeoman farmers and country craftsmen settled in that great, flat, pastorally fertile coastal area of England known as the Rumney Marsh, and associated with old towns and villages like Old Rumney and Bransit and Appledore, all of which you will see on the map and the illustrations. And then in the early years of the 19th century, John Sharwood's father, Stephen, who'd been born in Bransit in Kent in 1785, moved a few miles across the border into the small town of Rye in Sussex. He too, like John, was a wheelwright. In the year 1854, the year in which he died, he was living in an early Georgian terrace in Rye, in Rope Walk, named Seymour Place. And you can see this terrace to the left at the bottom of the hill in the modern photograph. Now, why Stephen moved to Rye is a matter of speculation. There was a good deal of rural dislocation at the end of the 18th century, with many small farms being swallowed up in what was called the enclosure movement. And this dislocation was exacerbated by the Napoleonic Wars, which particularly affected this part of England, because the channel here is at its narrowest, and this coast was very vulnerable to invasion. So Stephen would have been by no means the only country dweller who felt that he and his family would be more secure, both economically and in every other way, if they moved into a town. So it was then that our John was born in 1818, not on the Rumney Marsh, where his ancestors had lived for so long, but in the enchanting little town of Rye, and he was baptized in the great medieval parish church of St. Mary the Virgin, which crowns the hill on which Rye is built. Rye was once a port, and a very important port, one of the so-called Cinque Ports, which bore a heavy responsibility for the naval defence of England. The channel once lapped its walls, as you can see in the early 17th century drawing. But even by 1818, the waters of the channel had long since receded, leaving Rye stranded, as it were, on its great rocky promontory in a sea of pasture land rather than water. It still had access to the channel by river, and shipbuilding still was, and still, for that matter, still is, one of its principal industries. But Rye was now, by 1818, really just another small country town. Eliza Smith, who was to marry John, was also born in Rye in 1818 and baptized in St. Mary the Virgin. I think she actually had a better claim to be regarded as a Ryer, as the phrase goes, than John himself. Her father William was a sailor, and her mother's family, the Tiltmans, were shipbuilders and had been long settled in Rye. I have been told that the Tiltmans were also smugglers, as indeed the Sharwoods of Rumney Marsh may well have been. The whole of this area was in fact notorious for smuggling. As I mentioned, the channel here is at its narrowest point, and boats from Rye and adjacent areas like Rumney Marsh secretly rendezvoused with French boats in mid-channel, and they smuggled in large quantities of luxury goods like brandy and laces and fine fabrics. Smuggling was in fact one of Rumney Marsh's principal industries from the Middle Ages until well into the 19th century. And it worked both ways, because the men of Rumney Marsh smuggled contraband English wool across the Channel to France for rich rewards. As John and Eliza were Wesleyans, it's perhaps worth quoting from John Wesley's journal about a visit he made to Rye in 1773. Monday, November the 22nd, I set out for Sussex, and found abundance of people willing to hear the good word, at Rye in particular. And they do many things gladly, but they will not part from the accursed thing smuggling. So I fear with regard to these, our labour will be in vain. Incidentally, when I say that John and Eliza were Wesleyans, that is, Wesleyan Methodists, as their migration records state, it would probably be more accurate to say that they were both church and chapel, as the phrase of the day went. That is, they looked to their Church of England parish church for major things like baptisms, marriages, funerals, perhaps even for Holy Communion, but they were also members of a local Methodist society, as those early congregations of Methodism were called. John and Eliza were married in February of 1840. Curiously, they were not married in the church in which they had both been baptized in Rye, but in the even more ancient medieval church of St. Michael at Pleydon, which is about half a mile up the hill outside the Landgate of Rye. It may be that if John, at any rate, was then living outside the Landgate boundary, and I'm inclined to think that he was, then he was technically within the parish of Pleydon. Pleydon Church has a strange twisted steeple, which you might be able to see in the illustrations. And for centuries, this odd steeple was a great landmark, especially for ships at sea. In the 1950s, when I first visited this area, I was told a rhyme about Pleydon, which goes like this: Pleydon Church, crooked steeple, drunken parson, wicked people. Well, I don't know what story lies behind that, but perhaps it was smuggling. Let's move on quickly now to John and Eliza's migration in 1841. They came to Australia as assisted migrants, with a free passage under a government scheme known as the Bounty Migrant Scheme. This was a scheme deliberately designed to bring to Australia young, fit, skilled tradesmen, preferably married, for engagement to Australian employers. These employers were responsible for their selection, usually through agents, and they initially paid the passage money. But this money was refunded to the employers by way of a so-called bounty when their chosen migrants arrived and were adjudged suitable by the local authorities. Well, that at any rate was the theory of the bounty migrant scheme. In actual practice, it didn't work all that well, and it was ultimately scrapped. But for some years, and as it happens especially in the year 1841, it was responsible for the arrival in Australia of many thousands of admirable migrants who did fulfill all the necessary criteria, as was certainly the case with our John and Eliza. Why did they choose to migrate? Well, in the absence of any personal records, we are once again obliged to guess. And my guess is that the reasons were primarily economic. Rural England was in severe depression in the late 1830s and the 1840s, very severe depression. And in those years, thousands migrated in search of greener pastures. I suspect that John and Eliza were caught up in that prevailing tide. But why they chose New South Wales rather than the much closer green pastures of, say, the United States or Canada, I can't say. They sailed from Plymouth on the bark Burrampooter on the 19th of April 1841, arriving in Sydney on the 7th of August, a voyage of 110 days, just over 3 months, with, incidentally, no ports of call en route. Ironically, the only known illustration of the Burrampooter shows her being wrecked. She had a very short life. She was a new ship in April 1841. This, I think, was her maiden voyage. But she was wrecked near Margate on the coast of Kent only 2 years later, in 1843. As you can see, the Illustrated London News published a graphic wood engraving of the wrecking and told of the safe rescue of all the passengers and crew. Here is a photograph of another 19th century bark, the Canna, of comparable tonnage to the Burrampooter. And in full sail, the Burrampooter must have looked much like this. For purposes of comparison, both the Burrampooter and the Canna would have been a little smaller than the historic bark Polly Woodside, which the National Trust maintains in dry dock in Melbourne. Now, if you know the Polly Woodside, I think you'll find that amazing. Remember that the Burrampooter carried 234 migrants, as well as crew and a few cabin passengers, in all some 250 people. These were all ships of around 500 to 600 tons. However, only 20 years or so later, the migrant ships on the Australia run were much larger and faster, the famous clipper ships of some 2,000 tons. The Burrampooter was tiny by comparison with such great clippers as the Marco Polo, the Lightning, and the Red Jacket. Note the Red Jacket, because we'll be hearing of her again. Incidentally, I've not been able to trace the origin of that rather curious name, Burrampooter. It sounds as if it may have had Indian connotations. It doesn't appear to be a place name. There is a Burram in Kent, but without the Pooter, and the name of the ship is always spelt as one word. So the name remains a bit of a mystery. While, as I say, she was a new ship in 1841, and therefore must have been clean, at least at the start of the voyage, and although she was not significantly overcrowded, as some migrant ships were, and the health of her passengers remained remarkably good throughout, it must, for all that, have been an extremely tedious, uncomfortable, and certainly at times when storms were raging, quite terrifying voyage, if we can rely on the accounts of similar voyages at this time and on contemporary illustrations. The Sydney Press said that the Burrampooter's passage had been remarkably rough. John and Eliza must have been delighted and relieved to set foot on solid ground again when the ship finally and safely reached Sydney. Here are some illustrations of the Sydney of the 1840s which they encountered, and I begin with a luminous and enchanting lithograph of ships disembarking migrants in Sydney Harbour. Ironically, John and Eliza would have found that New South Wales itself was in the midst of a severe depression. For many migrants at this time, especially those from cities, this proved to be a near disaster. But of course, John and Eliza were not from cities. They were country people, and it would seem that they went almost immediately to a large pastoral property in the Hunter River Valley called Lewinsbrook, in which they were to spend the next few years. Here are photographs of the main Lewinsbrook house as it was in the year 2000, and black and white illustrations from watercolours held now in the Mitchell Library in Sydney of Lewinsbrook in much earlier days. In the 1840s, Lewinsbrook was owned by the Park family, and they, through agents, were probably John and Eliza's migration sponsors. The property lies about halfway between the modern towns of Dungog and Gresford, that is north of Maitland. It was then, in the 1840s, a very large estate of about 9,000 acres, with sheep, cattle, crops, orchards, vineyards. And like similar properties in the 1830s and the 1840s, it was really rather like a miniature village. It housed in cottages and outbuildings the craftsmen and the labourers that it needed. And it was while they were at Lewinsbrook that John and Eliza's first child was born, William, who was born on the 24th of May, 1842. Conceived as he must have been quite shortly after their arrival in Sydney, this child was to be the token of their faith and hope in their Australian future. How long John and Eliza remained in residence at Lewinsbrook, I don't know. John was clearly a man of great self-confidence and independence. You only have to look at his photographs to know that. And I suspect that he struck out on his own as soon as he decently could. Although the baptismal records of their next three children, Francis in 1844, Louisa in 1846, and Annie in 1848, these show that they remained for some years in the general Maitland, Hunter Valley area. My great-aunt Annie Sharwood, who was one of William's daughters, told me many years ago that Eliza and the children were sometimes left on their own in the early days, when John went off somewhere to, as she used to put it, and that Eliza, again to quote my great-aunt, had trouble backs. Well, stories and all picture of the Mate area. This was why John and Eliza moved at the end of the 1840s to Moreton Bay, modern-day Brisbane, where their second son, John, was born in 1851. But they were not to stay there very long. By 1854, they had moved down the New South Wales coast to the Shoalhaven region, and specifically to the little village of Gerringong, where a modern street is named after them. A local newspaper hailed John on his arrival there as a well-known ploughmaker from the county of Sussex. In a photograph taken in the 1950s, my mother and father stand by what we were told was probably the original smithy of Gerringong, and a rather smudgy reproduction of a photograph of about 1880 would seem consistent with this. John and Eliza's fourth daughter, another Eliza, was born in this area in 1854. And our earliest authentic relic of them is this Sunday school prize. which was given to their son William at Shoalhaven in 1855. It's interesting to note, by the way, that the name in the inscription is spelt Sherwood. Now that's clearly a mistake, but it might give us a glimpse of the Rye accent with which John and Eliza undoubtedly spoke. Perhaps with their country accent, Sharwood did sound rather like Sherwood. And it's rather sobering to think that if we could speak to John and Eliza today, we might actually find them quite difficult to understand. This cedar chest belonged to John Sharwood, and may well have been made by him when they were in the Shoalhaven area, because that was a great cedar cutting district. On the cedar chest there is a hammer which once belonged to John, and which indeed he may have made, forging the iron head himself, and also a slide rule which belonged to him, and which he can be seen carrying in an 1870s photograph. About 1856, a whole convoy of people from the Shoalhaven area travelled overland to the great, glittering, golden Victorian town of Ballarat. And John and Eliza, I suspect, were among them, because 1856 certainly was the year in which they made that very move, reaching Ballarat in February of 1856. This move to Ballarat, which was to be the last they made together, marked the turning point in John and Eliza's Australian fortunes, because John prospered in Ballarat. We find him first in 1857 in Lydiard Street. Note that he appears to be in some kind of partnership with a Mr. Morell, of whom we shall certainly hear more later. In 1858, they were living on Bakery Hill. And then, probably in the mid-1860s, they moved to live and to work in Peel Street South in Ballarat East. All the family properties on and in the vicinity of Peel Street South are now built over, principally, I'm sorry to say, by the Coles supermarket. The old street plan suggests that the coach building yard was about here, with John and Eliza's residence 4 houses down from the Little Bridge Street corner. Both William and John Jr. and their families lived around this corner to the left. A once unmade lane or road ran behind the Peel Street premises, later named Sharwood Street. A truncated Sharwood Street still runs north off Eastwood Street, but no longer goes through to Little Bridge Street, having been swallowed up by that same supermarket car park. We get an impression of this general area as it was in 1872 from this panoramic photograph taken from the Town Hall Tower, although it's hard to be confident about particular buildings. This artist's version of the same panoramic view probably captures the atmosphere of the area rather better, even if not accurate in every detail. But with one notable exception, these are the best contemporary images of what we might call the Sharwood Peel Street sacred sites that we seem to have. The 3 Peel Street South cottages we're showing now, from turn-of-the-century photographs, also convey atmosphere, although none would seem to have any direct Sharwood associations. The one notable exception is this precious pair of sepia carte de visite photographs, which I calculate to have been taken in the early to the mid 1870s. These show John and Eliza in the yard of their house, with another lady I shall presently tell you about. In the first photograph, the trellised facade of the house is to the left. Behind the hedge and the large wigwam stack of timber at the back rises the escarpment of Ballarat West. Under magnification, it is just possible to make out the east end and windows of Christchurch Parish Church on Lydiard Street South on the top of the escarpment. This enables us to deduce that the front of the house was at right angles to Peel Street South and faced the north. And the shadows tell us that this photograph was taken about noon on a sunny winter's day. Note that in this first photograph, John is wearing his Sunday best, while Eliza has put on an apron. And note too the washing drying on the hedge. The second photograph shows the front of the house from the other angle. And we can now see a little of a wing of the house which must run parallel with Peel Street South. And for this photograph, John has put on his working clothes and holds his slide rule, while Eliza has taken off her apron. For many years, the identity of the second lady in these photographs was a complete mystery to me. Recently, however, following up a tiny clue, I realized that she was a Miss Jane Lorimer. Now, Jane Lorimer was the elder sister of Agnes Lorimer, who married William Sharwood, of more anon. She migrated to Australia in 1870, so that's how we know that these photographs must be later than 1870. As she was at this stage still unmarried, it seems probable that she was actually living with John and Eliza. This much later photograph of Jane, now Mrs. Farrer, makes the identification quite clear. John's probate papers show that she had helped to finance his business, so she is an important figure in John's story. At Peel Street South, John progressed from blacksmithing and wheelwrighting, his original skills, to full-scale coach building. We made a visit to modern-day Sovereign Hill in Ballarat to capture some of the sights and sounds that would have been so familiar to John in his own workplace, with the very generous cooperation of the Sovereign Hill people. Sovereign Hill is exactly of John and Eliza's era. The main street attempts to reproduce as closely as possible their main street, that is, the main street from about 1850 to about 1870. We, of course, were particularly interested in the wheelwrights and coach builders' yards. Even although the wheelwrighting technology we are to see may have been a few years after John's time, this was very much his working world, and we, his descendants, might well feel that we are here in close touch with the man himself.
There you go, there's the silver turned down. Come back the other way now. Three sides again on the lathe. This one's for over. The lane's just deep, square cut, four sides on the bottom of the straw, with 12 inch and clear wheel. The wheel is virtually the same. So it stops only got At this stage, the guide hub is mounted up on what's virtually a dummy axle. It can be revolved around, supported underneath a good solid block of timber. It all comes down to as heavy a hammer as gives you swing. With this here, really is a matter of finally into it. The next job to be done is to cut tangs on the ends of each of the spokes. To fit them, started off on the first tang, and at this stage you require the use of the spoke guide. What happens now, out at the end of the tank, the spoke and the hole, they don't line up. You have to be able to flex your spoke across to hook it on, and from here, just a matter of driving it home. You keep smiling, get the saddle, cut it off, and start up all again. Do the fire all the way around. Chips, bits of bone, before you scratch the water, straight up and down. Take from your
Susanna, who was John and Eliza's last child, was born in Ballarat in 1860, and she's shown here in this photograph as a child with her mother. Eliza, the daughter that had been born to them in 1854, when they were in the Shoalhaven district, had died in 1858, 2 years previously. She was their only child to die in infancy, and in that regard John and Eliza were fortunate in their generation. But before I tell you a little more about the family, I'd like to relate to you the story of the big wheels controversy of 1864. Not only is this a very entertaining story in its own right, but at the very end of it, we hear the authentic voice of John Sharwood himself in a letter of his own composition, which, as such, is unique in our family records. This is a photograph taken in 1860 of the then new premises in Sturt Street of the newspaper The Ballarat Star, in the columns of which this story appeared. Note on their right the premises of a coach builder and wheelwright named James Morell, presumably the Morell with whom John was in some sort of partnership in 1857. On Tuesday the 14th of June 1864, the Ballarat Star reported as follows. On Monday, Mr. James Morell, wheelwright, turned out for Messrs. Smith and Craig, engine carriers, a set of 4 wagon wheels, which are probably the heaviest ever made in Ballarat, or in fact in the colony. The tyres are 9 inches in width. The iron employed weighs about 2,500 weight, and the perfected wheels are capable of conveying 20 tons. The object of making the wheels with such wide tyres is to prevent them sinking into grassy land during winter weather. Well, 3 days later, an anonymous letter appeared in the paper headed "Wheels Within Wheels," and this is how it read.
Sir, in your issue of Tuesday, I saw notice taken of the heavy wheels turned out by Mr. Morell for Messrs. Smith and Craig, for which he gets the credit. They were made on the premises of Mr. Mahatty by Mr. Sharwood, and the 2,500 weight of iron employed about them, when weighed a second time, would dwindle down to less than half. Signed. I am one that saw Sharwood make the wheels.
The next day, Mr. Morell himself entered the fray. In a long letter, he said that Smith and Craig wanted the wheels in a hurry, and as he, Morell, was very busy, he arranged for Mr. Sharwood, who, he said, is a wheelwright that works occasionally at Mahatty's, to do the wheelwrighting, and to do it at Mahatty's premises. When the woodwork was put together, wrote Morell, the wheels were returned, and the important part of shutting up and putting on the tyres was done at my shop. Well, this was too much for our John, and a few days later he wrote a fighting letter of his own, and here it is, in full. Sir, in your issue of the 18th inst, I see a little concerning me about Messrs. Smith and Craig's wheels. Now, I will let the public know the truth, and they may judge for themselves. I have made all Messrs. Smith and Craig's wheels for the last 6 years. Smith wanted me and Mr. Mahatty to tender for the said wheels, and we did so, as others beside us, Mr. Morell being the successful tenderer for ironwork and painting. Mr. Smith gave me the order to make the said wheels. I did so, and he paid me for them. So I had nothing to do with Mr. Morell, nor he with me. I, for one, never want credit for another man's labour. I have an established business of my own at Mr. Mahatty's, not occasionally as Mr. Morell represents, and anyone wanting me can find me there. Apologising for trespassing on you for insertion in your paper, I remain yours respectfully, J. Sherwood, wheelwright. It's a great letter, isn't it? Confident, forthright, vigorous, the letter of a man who's made his own way in the world and wants to be respected for it. I, for one, never want credit for another man's labour. That, I suspect, was the creed by which John Sharwood lived and worked. And it does rather look as if he and his former partner had had some serious falling out. Before going on with the story, let's look at some more images of the Ballarat which John and Eliza knew, growing astonishingly as it did from the rough settlement of tents and makeshift buildings of the early 1850s to the substantial city of the late 1870s. And the accompanying music is all from Australia's colonial past, as indeed is all the music that we have used in our Australian sequences. In the 1860s, John and Eliza's children began to marry, and in due course to give them grandchildren. Annie was the first to marry in 1864, the big wheels year. She married Walter Watkins, who'd been born in Surrey. 1867 was something of a Sharwood annus mirabilis, because in that year all three of Annie's older siblings married. Thus William, here depicted nursing his son William Henry, the eldest of the family, a sweet-natured and handsome young man, married Agnes Lorimer, a young gentlewoman from Scotland. Well, she was youngish. She was actually some 7 or 8 years his senior, but I'm afraid she understated her age. We've already met her older sister Jane. Agnes, with her brother Andrew and his wife, had sailed out 4 years ahead of Jane on the famous clipper ship Red Jacket, of which we saw an illustration much earlier. Frances, the eldest daughter, and I rather think the family's Rock of Gibraltar, married Nathaniel Jenkins, who'd been born in Lancashire. Finally, in that same year, 1867, Louisa, the most strikingly good-looking of the daughters, married Christian Fricke, a young German migrant with whom, as the records show, John in his last years had a close business relationship. In 1873, the second son, John Jr., who was a shoemaker, married Julia Ellen Breton, a girl from the Channel Islands. Very sadly, no clearly authentic photograph of either John or Julia has yet been discovered, but we can show you a family Bible that was presented to them shortly after their marriage by John and Eliza, and the dedication page in that Bible. By sheer chance, nearly 100 years later, this Bible turned up in a Melbourne suburban op shop. It was found there by my own brother, another John Sharwood, and we have since presented it to John and Julia's direct descendants, so that once again it is in the hands of the appropriate branch of the family. With these marriages, John and Eliza must have felt that all was set fair for a secure, serene, prosperous old age. But it was not to be. On Thursday, the 1st of May, 1879, John was struck down with what must have been a severe bout of erysipelas. Erysipelas is an acute inflammatory condition of the skin and sometimes of the membranes. In those days, before antibiotics, it could prove fatal, especially if it attacked the lungs, when it could lead to pneumonia. Our robust and active John, who was only 60 years of age and still in his prime, as his photographs of the 1870s clearly reveal, and who had not yet bothered to make a will, was dead within 4 days. He died at home on Monday, the 5th of May, 1879. The Ballarat papers noted his death with sorrow. John had clearly become a well-known figure. "Another old pioneer has passed from amongst us," wrote the Ballarat Star. Eliza gave John an elaborate funeral, building for him and herself the substantial and elegant double grave of marble and iron in the dress circle of the Ballarat New Cemetery. This is a photograph of it when it was new. Eliza, widowed, as she appears in this last photograph we have of her, and bearing traces of a hard life, though she must have been handsome herself once, think of those good-looking children. Eliza lived on in Ballarat for a few years, but she then moved to Melbourne, not long, I suspect, after her youngest daughter Susanna married Thomas Taylor in 1881. Thomas Taylor had been born in Geelong, and he was thus the only one amongst the sons-in-law and daughters-in-law to be native-born, as of course all the Sharwood children were. In Melbourne, Eliza lived with her daughter Frances Jenkins. Although on her own death in 1897, she was taken back to Ballarat to lie beside John in the grave she had built for them both long before. Well, here we are at John and Eliza's grave as it is today. But of course we're not here to mourn. We're here to celebrate. We're here to celebrate their life together and what they made of that life when they came to Australia all those years ago. The grave may look a little shabby, but in recent years it has been carefully and professionally conserved. On advice, we didn't feel able to restore it as new, because to do that, I'm afraid, would be to attract vandals. But it is, I can assure you, as solid and as secure as John and Eliza's own achievement. That great leap of faith, John and Eliza's migration to Australia in 1841, had proved immensely successful. They'd never become truly wealthy, but they'd prospered greatly, and well beyond any point they could have hoped to have achieved if they had remained as humble residents of Rye in rural Sussex. They'd significantly improved their position in society. They had reared handsome, healthy children, and those children were now founding families of their own. Already the first native-born generation was spreading across Australia, so that today John and Eliza's descendants are to be found in every mainland state and territory. So this has been a great story, well worth telling and well worth celebrating. To mark the 150th anniversary of their arrival in Australia, a large family reunion was held on Advent Sunday, the 1st of December 1991, at Sharwood House, Ivanhoe Girls' Grammar School in Melbourne. Sharwood House had once been the family home of John Henry Sharwood, a grandson of John and Eliza, who'd been both the founder and benefactor of the school. This documentary concludes then with photographs taken at that family reunion, and the background music is an adaptation of Advance Australia Fair, an adaptation written by your narrator and here as sung at a great concert in St Paul's Cathedral, Melbourne in June of 1993. I rather think that John and Eliza would have been astonished by both occasions, both by the reunion and by the concert. But I hope they would have been proud, as we are proud of them and continue to reap the rewards of their great adventure. Three matters have come to light since we made the video recording, which deserve mention by way of postscript. First, English researchers have identified John's mother as Hannah, maiden name Reeds, who had died of consumption in 1839 prior to John's migration. Stephen, his father, had married Hannah at Lydd, near Brensett, in 1805. 6 of their children survived Stephen's own death in 1854, but clearly several more had predeceased him, dying young. Stephen remarried, but there were no more children. Second, we have discovered that John bought no less than 16 blocks of town land at the first land sales in Gerringong in 1854-5, making him the largest landholder in the infant village. We show an early town map on which John's blocks are coloured red, and by way of comparison, we also show a map of the much larger modern township on which the original village plan has been coloured in green near the bottom of the map. This remarkably large land purchase is probably to be explained by the substantial earning capacity of scarce skilled craftsmen in the immediate post-Goldrush years. Although there is a vague and unsubstantiated family story that John himself found some gold in the early New South Wales gold rush. He certainly did not inherit significant capital. We've checked that out with his father's probate papers in England. John sold all his Gerringong land to a pair of buyers in October 1856, making quite a profit on the deal. Thirdly, the discovery of these Gerringong land dealings led us to a recalculation from several sources of the date of John's move to Ballarat, for which there is no direct evidence. This recalculation now establishes that the family's arrival in Ballarat occurred in February 1857, not 1856, as we originally stated.